The crying stopped the second my boots touched the gravel. Not trailing off. Not the way a child's crying quiets when something startles them into silence. That progressive diminuendo, the intake of breath before the next round. Just off, like a switch thrown. I stood on the shoulder of I-40 westbound, mile marker 191, maglite in my hand, engine running behind me, hazards blinking orange across the scrub. 11:47 p.m., mid-October, temperature somewhere in the low 40s. The sound that had put my foot off the gas and brought a 74,000-pound truck to a full stop on the New Mexico high desert had been, 3 seconds ago, a child crying. Now there was nothing. I've been driving this corridor for 11 years. T-Carver, Unit 7, CDL carrier out of Albuquerque distribution. I know the difference between what the desert offers up by mistake. Coyotes, fence wire, wind through a culvert, and what it doesn't. A coyote pitch isn't the same pitch. Wind in wire doesn't carry that much grief. What I heard coming through the cracked passenger vent, before I'd registered what I was hearing, was a child, maybe 3 years old. That high, thin, overtired register. My daughter, when she was that age, cried exactly like that when she woke frightened in the night. You know the sound. It bypasses the thinking part of you and goes somewhere older. My foot was off the gas before I'd made any decision. If the Skinwalkers are keeping you up, subscribe. I post 3 nights a week. I walked the shoulder back maybe 50 feet from the truck. The flashlight covered the right shoulder, the fence line, and the ground beyond it for a good stretch. Nothing. No child. No adult. No vehicle. Not on the pull-off, not parked ahead or behind me. The gravel on the south side of the road was undisturbed except where my boots had broken it. I swept the beam left across the median and the northbound shoulder. Empty in both directions, as far as I could see. The wind moved through the chamisa. Somewhere to the north, headlights traced a ranch access road 2 miles out. That was all the sound the world had. I stood there 3, maybe 4 minutes, sweeping the light back and forth across the fence line and the flats beyond it. The moon was high, throwing shadow off the scrub. You could see out into the desert a good 100 yards from the shoulder without a flashlight. Fence posts, low sage, the line where the high desert leveled off and became nothing. I looked at all of it. There was nothing to find. I got back in, logged the stop, 11:47, pulled over mile 191 westbound, possible distress sound, source not located, no persons found, resumed route. I told myself, coyote, acoustic mirage, late night, long run, ears working too hard. I've been on this road for 11 years, and I know what it feels like when the desert offers you something it made by mistake. I talked myself down. Departed Albuquerque earlier that night at 10:45 p.m. Load manifest, dry goods, and household freight. Bound Flagstaff. It had been a clean run until then. I-40 west, emptying out past Rio Puerco. Construction zones quiet, cars gone. Just the headlights and the radio, and the good kind of nothing the late night desert offers when there's no reason to stop. Reach Flagstaff at 5:20 a.m. Dock sealed, freight intact. Dead-headed to a rest stop outside Winslow by 7:30 and slept 4 hours. Nothing unusual. October 15th. Picked up a partial load out of Winslow early afternoon. Plastics, consumer goods, and headed east on I-40. Stopped at the Pilot in Gallup for fuel and a hot meal around 5 p.m. I remember the meal clearly. Ordered eggs and hash browns. Everything looked fine. I sat in the booth for 20 minutes and couldn't start it. Not nausea. I wasn't sick. Just couldn't lift the fork. I watched other people eat. I drank the coffee. Eventually, I threw most of the meal away, bought a second coffee to go, and logged it as lost appetite. Probably fatigue. It wasn't fatigue. I didn't know what else to write. Return run was clean. I crossed the Rio Puerto Bridge eastbound at 8:47 p.m. I know, because I looked at the clock. I passed mile marker 191, going the other direction, and I did not slow down, and I did not look at the shoulder, and I logged the temperature, 39 degrees Fahrenheit, and I drove. Back at the yard, by 10:15. Logbook signed. Went home. The next day was a day off. No incidents worth noting. October 17th. My wife made dinner. I slept in my own bed. Second night home, 2:15 a.m. My wife woke me. She said there was a child crying somewhere outside. Our street is a cul-de-sac in the Northeast Heights. 12 houses, older neighborhood, large lots. The family 2 doors down has a daughter, but she's 9. Nobody on the block has a child that young. I went to the window and I heard it. Not clearly, not close, muffled by distance, from somewhere past the back fence. That same thin, high, overtired register. My wife was standing at my shoulder. We both listened. When I raised the sash, it stopped. I told her it was probably a cat in the Garcia's yard. Cats sound like children sometimes, especially at night, especially if you're half asleep. She knows this. She believed me. She went back to bed. I stood at the window until 4 a.m. I watched the yard. I watched the fence. I watched the alley beyond the gate where the street lamp doesn't reach. Nothing moved. October 18th. My wife's hairbrush was on the back porch. She keeps it on the left side of the bathroom counter. She has done this for 4 years. We don't take it outside. We don't have any reason to take it outside. She found it sitting on the porch railing, bristles up, like someone had set it there deliberately and thought about where to put it. I went out back and walked the fence line. The gate was padlocked, 6 feet of solid cedar, no gaps at the ground. The soil along the fence base was hard and dry. We hadn't had rain in 3 weeks. If anyone had come over the fence, they hadn't left me a way to read it. The welcome mat at the back door had been moved, not far. The right edge was no longer flush against the doorframe, the way my wife sets it. Shifted maybe 2 inches toward the step. I stood in the backyard in the early morning, looking at the fence and the railing and the mat and the sky going grey over the sandias. I was trying to make a sequence of events that accounted for all of it. I could almost do it, for any piece alone. Together, I couldn't. I went back inside. My wife asked me what I was looking for. I told her nothing. October 19th. Departed early for a long haul south and west, I-25 to Socorro. Then out through Magdalena and Datil and Camado. The plains of San Agustin. Big empty country with no cell service and no reason to stop. I fueled in Socorro at noon. The woman working the counter was somewhere in her 50s. I asked her while she was running my card if she knew anything about mile marker 191 on I-40 West. If there was anything out there people talked about. She looked at me for a long time before she answered. She said she wasn't from around there, and she wasn't Navajo, and she didn't know the local stories. She said it the way people say something when they know exactly what they mean. and have decided not to say it. She handed me my receipt. She turned back to the counter and started straightening a display of sunflower seeds that didn't need straightening. I sat in the truck in the parking lot for a while before I started the engine. I thought about how the crying had stopped the instant my tires touched the gravel. Not gradually, immediately. I thought about the sleeper compartment and how during the long return run, the silence had felt wrong in a way I hadn't been able to name until now. Too complete, the way a room sounds when something in it has stopped breathing. I thought about the hairbrush and the mat. I thought about that woman's face while she was deciding what to say. I started the truck. I drove. 10:22 p.m. Pull off outside Quemado. Engine off. Temperature around 30. The sky was doing what it does out there at night. All the stars up and away with no ambient light for 30 miles in any direction. I was in the sleeper, lying down, not yet asleep, listening to the wind work against the cab. Then I heard it again. Not from outside the truck, not from the direction of the windows, from inside the cab, from the air around me, the way a smell fills a room. Not from a specific corner or panel I could locate, just present. That same high, thin, overtired crying. I watched the clock on the dash through the gap in the curtain. 11 minutes. I did not move. I did not turn on a light. I did not open the curtain or call out. I lay still and I watched the numbers change, and I breathed as slowly as I could manage. Something told me to stay small, to be still, to not announce myself to whatever was listening for me to announce myself. I listened to that thing instead of the other part of me, which wanted to turn on every light in the cab and open the sleeper door and look. At 11 minutes and some seconds, it stopped. I drove the last stretch to Quemado with the cab lights on and the radio loud enough I couldn't hear anything else. I watched both shoulders. I ate from a bag in the passenger footwell without taking my eyes off the road. Delivered next morning. Long run home on I-25. October 20th, day off. My wife called from the grocery store in the afternoon to ask if I had taken anything off the back porch. She said the wind chimes were gone. We put them up 3 years ago. They've been there ever since. Neither of us took them down. I went out and looked at the hook they'd hung from. The hook was still there. The wire was still there, still tied to the hook, still intact, just empty at the end where the chimes would have been. As if the chimes themselves had been lifted off and taken, leaving the wire behind. I stood on the porch for a while. October 21st. I have a run scheduled for Thursday, west on the I-40, the standard corridor. I haven't told my wife about mile marker 191. I've been working out how to say it, and whether saying it does anything useful, or just makes it real in a way it isn't yet, or makes it worse in a way I don't understand. The woman in Socorro chose not to say what she knew. I've been thinking about whether that was a reasonable decision or the only decision available to her. I've been thinking about the wire still tied to the hook, about the hairbrush someone said bristles up on the railing, about the sound in the sleeper that wasn't coming from the windows, wasn't coming from a corner, wasn't coming from anywhere I could name. I've been thinking about how the crying stopped the second my boots touched the gravel, about how I stood out there on the shoulder at mile marker 191 with a flashlight and found nothing. And then I got back in the truck. I kept driving. Thursday's run goes west on I-40. It was already inside with me. I want to say up front that I'm writing this because I'm going to forget the details if I don't, and because I've been going back and forth on whether to say anything to anyone, and I've decided that writing it down is not the same as saying it to a person, and so I can do this without it meaning anything. Her name was Renata. She was 34 years old. She died of a brain aneurysm in the spring of last year, in her apartment in Denver, on a Thursday morning when she was getting ready for work. Renata and I had worked together for 6 years. She was one of those people you assume will be in your life indefinitely. And then, she wasn't. I drove through Arizona in August. Road trip, the kind I'd been putting off for 3 years. The southern route through New Mexico and into Arizona, then up through the canyon country, then a long loop home. I was doing it alone, which is how I prefer long drives, and I'd been mostly off the main highways since Albuquerque. The smaller roads slow you down, but the country is better. Renata had wanted to do this trip. We talked about it several times over the years in the idle way that co-workers talk about the trips they haven't taken yet, the ones that live in the someday category, where there's no pressure to actually plan them. She had a list she kept on her phone of things she wanted to do in the Southwest specifically. The Painted Desert, the Navajo Nation, the Canyon Country in Utah. She never went. After she died, I thought about that list periodically in the way you think about things that belong to someone when the someone is gone. Not with grief exactly, more with a specific kind of attention, like the thing is still there and deserves to be noticed, even if the person isn't. I stopped at a trading post on the edge of the Navajo Nation. I won't put the exact location because I looked it up when I got home, and I'm not sure what it would mean to have that on the record. I stopped for gas and a cold drink. The station was one of those places that exists on the margin of everything. A cluster of pumps under a faded canopy, a low building with a hand-painted sign, a payphone that I doubted worked, and nothing in any direction but high desert for 10 miles. The kind of place where you use the bathroom whether you need to or not, because the next one is a long way. I filled the tank. I went inside. The woman behind the counter was Renata. I know how that sounds. I'm aware of how that sounds. I'm going to try to be precise about what I mean. The woman behind the counter was the same height as Renata, which was average. She had Renata's face in its specific proportions, the width of the eyes, the slight asymmetry in the cheekbones, the way the lower lip was fuller than the upper. She had the same dark hair worn the same way, pulled back but not tight. I stood in the doorway of the trading post with a drink in my hand, and I looked at this woman, and every part of me that processes faces, whatever part of the brain does that work below the level of thinking, said Renata. The rational part kicked in after maybe 2 seconds. Renata is dead. I went to her memorial. I spoke to her parents. The rational part said, resemblance. It's a strong resemblance, and you were caught off guard, and your brain filled in a face it already knows. This happens. Grief does strange things with faces. I went to the counter. I set down the drink and my card. She looked at me, and she smiled, and the smile was wrong. I can't fully explain why. A smile is a smile, mouth, eyes, the particular quality of expression that accompanies it. But this one landed off register. The way certain words sound wrong when you've looked at them too long, even though nothing about the letters has changed. I smiled back. I said something about the weather. She said something in return. Her voice was lower than Renata's, which I noted, and her accent was different, which I noted. I was actively cataloging differences because the differences were what I needed. She ran my card. I signed. She said to drive safe. I walked back to the car and sat in it. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes. The pump receipt was in my hand. I was looking at the building. Through the plate glass window of the trading post, I could see her behind the counter, her back to me now, doing something on a low shelf. The road was empty in both directions. Sky was that particular high desert blue that feels like it's been bleached. A dog was lying in the shade of the building's east wall and had not moved since I pulled in. I couldn't stop looking at the back of her head. I drove north. The road climbed out of the flats and into the red rock country, and I told myself, that's done. Strong resemblance. Caught you off guard. It happens. Grief misfires on faces. You know this. 20 minutes later, my phone lit up on the passenger seat. I don't take calls driving, so I let it go to voicemail. When I stopped for water at a pull-off above a canyon rim, I checked it. It was Renata's mother. Renata's mother and I had spoken twice since the memorial. She called me now and then when she wanted to talk about her daughter. I didn't mind it. I listened. I called her back. She said she was calling to tell me about something she'd found while going through the last of Renata's things. A box she hadn't gotten to yet. She wanted me to know. I asked her if she was at home in Denver. She said yes. She'd been home all day. I sat on a flat rock above the canyon and looked at the road I'd come from. I could not see the trading post from there. Too much distance, too many bends. I talked with her for maybe 15 minutes. She was in Denver. She had been in Denver all morning. I don't know what that means. I knew before I dialed that it couldn't mean what I was afraid it meant. But I needed to hear her voice. I needed the confirmation that sat in a specific place in my chest and felt like two things at once. She told me about the box she'd found. Some papers, some photographs, a few small things she thought I might want to have. She told me Renata had written something in a journal. Nothing alarming, just her handwriting moving through ordinary days. She asked if I was doing all right, which was the question she always asked, and I said yes. And we talked for a while about Renata's handwriting and what it felt like to find it when you weren't expecting to. When we hung up, I sat on the rock for a long time. The canyon below was going dark at the bottom, while the rim was still in light. The air had been radiating heat all day and was finally letting it go. I watched the color change at the rim edge, and I thought about the woman behind the counter with her back to me in the plate glass window, and the dog in the shade of the east wall that had not moved. And I thought about how long it takes to notice what has been in front of you. I drove the rest of the day without stopping. I ate at a diner in a small town on the Colorado border, got a room at a motel, and lay in bed thinking about the woman's face in the plate glass window with her back to me. I keep coming back to the smile, the way it sat on her face. Renata had a particular smile. Warm, fast, a little wider on the left than the right. The woman at the counter had produced a smile that was structurally correct and felt like none of those things, like someone had been shown a description of a smile and had reproduced it from the description. I want to be clear. I do not believe in anything. I'm not a person who believes in things. I am a person who lived for 6 years next to someone and learned her face the way you learn the things you see every day. And I went into a trading post in the Arizona desert, and something was wearing that face behind the counter. I don't know what to do with that. There is probably nothing to do with it. What I keep turning over is the dog in the shade of the east wall. It was lying with its chin on its forepaws, eyes open, looking at the building. Not sleeping, just watching. I registered it when I drove in and thought, hot day, lazy dog. When I sat in my car for those 5 minutes looking at the woman through the glass, the dog had not moved at all. Not even a twitch of the ears when the pump clicked off. Not even a look toward me when I started the engine. It was watching the building. Only the building. It had been watching the building for a long time. I got home to Denver 6 days later. On the second day back, I drove past Renata's old apartment without planning to. The building was the same. The window that had been hers was dark. I don't visit the places that were hers. I don't think it helps anything. But I sat in the car in front of that building for a few minutes, the way you sit with things you can't do anything about. I thought about the woman at the trading post, and I thought about Renata's face and the distance between those two things, which was very large and also not large at all. I thought about the dog that had not moved. I thought about the word Renata always used for me, the short version of my name, which the woman had also used when she said goodbye. I thought about what the woman said when I signed the receipt and turned to leave. She said to drive safe, which is what you say. But she said my name. She said drive safe, and my first name, the short version no one uses except people who've known me a long time. I didn't give her my name. I paid with a card that has my full legal name on it, not the one anyone uses. Renata always called me by the short version. I haven't driven that road again. I don't think I will. I've been looking at the map of that part of Arizona, and I know where the trading post is, and I know the roads that approach it, and I have been noticing when I plan drives through the Southwest that I route around that entire area without fully deciding to. I've been looking at maps, trying to find another route that makes sense, and there isn't one. Not if I want to do that part of the country. But I don't think I want to do that part of the country anymore. The trading post is still listed online. It has a phone number. I've typed the number into my phone twice and not called it. I'm not sure what I'd ask. I'm not sure whoever answered would be the right thing to ask. I lived next to Elena Vigil for 9 years, and in those 9 years, I watched her do certain things that I decided, year by year, not to ask about. This is the account of what I watched her do and what I came to understand it meant. I'm writing it down now because she moved away last spring to be closer to her daughter's family in Santa Fe, and the house has been sold to someone from Albuquerque who leaves his shoes on the front step and parks in the driveway with the windows down and probably won't be here long. Elena is gone. What she knew is not written anywhere. I'm doing what I can with what I observed. Elena had lived in that house for 30 years before I moved in next door. She was somewhere in her late 60s when we became neighbors. A small, precise woman, a retired school teacher, with a garden in the backyard and a reputation in the community that I came to understand was the kind of reputation that is held carefully and quietly, like something that would spill if tilted. I moved to that valley because of the light and the low cost of land, and because I had come off a long stint in Albuquerque and wanted something slower. I was 38, I had no children and no particular ties, and I thought I would stay for a year or two, and ended up staying 9. The valley is one of those northern New Mexico valleys that was settled in the Spanish colonial era and has been continuously inhabited since, which means it has a long institutional memory and a particular relationship to what most people would call the supernatural, which the community there calls something more ordinary, not a mystery, more like weather, the kind of thing you accommodate and work around. I came from Albuquerque with an urban person's comfortable skepticism, and 9 years of close observation slowly adjusted that into something more like what I'd call provisional respect. Not belief exactly, an acknowledgement that there are organizing principles in this landscape that I was not educated to name. The first thing I noticed about Elena was the shoes. I have a covered porch on the front of my house. Most people on our road have covered porches. It gets warm enough in the summer that you want to sit outside after dark, and the porches face west toward the mesas, and the light dies over them in a way that rewards sitting with a glass of something and watching. Neighbors leave things on their porches, garden tools, planters, the mail if the carrier comes early. I left my work boots on mine because I didn't want to track adobe mud into the kitchen. Elena came over one afternoon in my first month. This was late autumn, the cottonwoods already stripped, with a plate of tamales and a welcome to the area. We talked on my porch. She was pleasant and warm and exactly as observant as someone who has spent 30 years paying attention to everything around the house with a history that I didn't know yet. As she was leaving, she noticed my boots. She looked at them for a moment, just a look, the way you look at something that needs a decision. Then she said, as casually as she could manage, that she kept everything of hers inside, even shoes, especially shoes. She said some people are old-fashioned about these things, and she was one of them, and she smiled and went home. I told myself, old-fashioned. I see that now as my first decision to not look at something directly. I brought the boots inside, not because I fully believed what she hadn't said, but because she said it in a way that made not believing feel expensive. She did not leave anything outdoors, ever. I watched her over the years, the way you watch a neighbor you are fond of, peripherally, without making it a project. Her garden tools were brought in at night, every night, even in the summer when they'd be used again the next morning. Her laundry dried on a rack inside rather than on a line, which is unusual out here where the line drying is faster and the air is always good. No shoes by the door, no forgotten umbrellas, no gloves left on the railing the way you forget gloves on a railing. Once, in my 3rd year there, I saw her at the kitchen window before dawn on a cold morning, and she was doing something careful with her hands at the sink. I couldn't see what, but when I went out for my newspaper, the doormat she normally kept just inside the threshold had been moved outside, and she was running her fingers along its edge, pressing it exactly flush against the doorframe. It had been left outdoors the night before. She was doing something to put it right. She saw me. She didn't acknowledge me. She went back inside. I started paying attention in a different way after that. The things Elena kept inside made a list, if you're watching. Shoes, yes, but also combs and brushes. I learned this over years of small observation. The way you'd see her carry a brush from the bathroom to the kitchen if she needed to do something at the window, rather than setting it down at the bathroom sill where the air moved through. Envelopes. This surprised me. I watched her more than once tear a mailing label off a return envelope and take the label inside before setting the envelope in the recycling. Her name on paper. She controlled where her name sat on paper, and she did it quietly and without explaining it. In my 5th year there, I mentioned something to Dario, who ran the hardware store in town and whose family had been in the valley for a long time. I framed it as a general question. The things old-timers do out here that might seem like superstition to someone from the city, but that have a logic behind them. He looked at me for a moment, then he said, "Whatever Elena Vigil does, she does for a reason." He went back to the shelf he'd been restocking. I drove home turning that over. I started keeping things inside. I won't say I understood completely. I didn't. But there are things you do because you've been told they matter by someone who has reason to know, and you decide to trust the knowledge even when you can't see the shape of it. I brought my shoes in. I stopped leaving the recycling near the road, with my return address visible on the top. When I had work done on the house and the contractor left a clipboard with my name and address on the porch, I moved it inside before I went to bed. Nothing happened to me in 9 years. I don't know if that's connected. What happened in the 7th year was different. There was a new family in the community, not on our road, but close, in the house that had sat empty for a while. A young family from the city, the kind that comes to these valleys with a feeling that the land is offering them something, and without knowing what the land asks in return. They were pleasant. They didn't know anything. I noticed in late fall that the here woman started looking tired. Not the good kind of tired. Not the kind that comes from physical work and honest outdoor life. The kind that lives behind the eyes, grey and persistent, the way illness looks when it's settling in rather than passing through. I saw her at the market. I saw her picking up her children from the school bus stop at the end of our road. Month by month, that winter, she was visibly less. Her husband came to ask if I knew a doctor in the area. This was in February. She'd been ill since November, he said. The doctors in Taos couldn't find anything. She had headaches that moved around and didn't respond to anything. She was losing weight. She couldn't sleep. I asked him if he'd noticed anything missing from around the property. He looked at me. He said, "What do you mean?" I asked him if anything had been displaced. Shoes, a comb, something with her name on it. Anything that had been left outdoors and then found somewhere it shouldn't be. or not found at all. He was quiet for a moment. He said her good brush had gone missing in October. He'd assumed one of the kids moved it, and there had been a card, a birthday card someone had sent her with her name in the address that had blown off the porch railing in a wind. He'd meant to find it and hadn't. I said, keep everything inside, everything personal. Her name on nothing visible from the road. No shoes outdoors. Brush and comb stay inside. I said it the way Eleanor had said it to me, as casually as I could, as if these were ordinary things to say. He looked at me for a long time. He nodded. I don't know if he believed me. He thanked me. He left. By the spring, she was better. I don't know what to do with that. I'm not saying I know what it means. I'm saying that by spring, she was better, and that by summer, the whole winter had the quality of something they were both putting behind them. They moved to be closer to family 18 months later. I watched them load the truck. Eleanor came to say goodbye when she left for Santa Fe. We sat on my porch. She approved of how I kept the porch, which was bare of everything except a chair and a plant in a glazed pot. She said she'd been a good neighbor. I told her she had. She looked out at the mesa for a while without saying anything. Then she said she hoped whoever came next would be willing to learn. She didn't mean learn in general. She meant the specific thing. She didn't say what it was. The man from Albuquerque moved in 3 weeks ago. He leaves his shoes by the front door. He parks with the windows down. There's a welcome mat outside his front door with the word welcome on it in large block letters, and under it in smaller print his house number, which is also his address. I've been trying to think of how to say what I need to say to him. I keep coming back to the way Eleanor said it to me, as casual as she could manage, almost nothing. Just, some people are old-fashioned about these things. What she gave me in that framing was a way to receive the information without having to decide all at once whether I believed it. Old-fashioned is a container that holds the knowledge without requiring you to examine it too closely at first. You can comply without committing, and compliance is what matters. The actions are the same whether you believe or simply proceed as if you might. Eleanor understood this. She'd said it this way on purpose. I keep thinking about how much I didn't understand for a long time, standing on the far side of what I know now, and how patient she was with that. I'm going to go over with something from the garden, introduce myself. It's the right thing to do. I'll stand on his porch, and I'll look at his shoes by the door, the same way she looked at mine all those years ago. And I'll say it as lightly as I can, and hope that he's the kind of person who hears what isn't being said. I hope he's that kind of person. Elena was right that not everyone is. My grandmother kept a tin box on the top shelf of her bedroom closet. She moved it with her from the reservation to Farmington, and then to Denver. And when she died, she left it to my mother. And when my mother died, she left it to me. I'd known the box my whole life without knowing what was in it. It was understood in the way that certain family things are understood without being explained, that the box was not mine to open. I opened it when I was 31, 6 weeks after my mother's funeral, alone in the apartment where I'd grown up in Denver. I was clearing things out. I told myself I was clearing things out. Inside the tin were several things. A folded piece of paper so old I was afraid to unfold it. A small pouch of something that smelled like dry earth and pollen. A piece of turquoise that had once been part of a bracelet, and a card in my grandmother's handwriting that said, in Navajo, that I had to have translated later. Something that roughly means, this was the price of our return. Be careful what you do with it. I didn't understand. I grew up in Denver. My grandmother was Navajo and traditional in ways I'd observed without learning, and my mother had drifted further from those things, and I had drifted further still. I knew my family had survived the long walk, the forced removal in 1864, the 4 years of imprisonment at Fort Sumner. I knew we came back. I didn't know the cost. The land where my grandmother was born had passed to a distant cousin after she left, and then out of the family through a series of transfers I didn't fully understand, and I'd assumed I had no connection to it anymore. But in her estate, there was a deed document, not to the original land, but to a smaller parcel adjacent to it on the Colorado Plateau. High desert, remote. She'd paid for it and told no one, and paid the taxes on it every year for 30 years. I drove up in late June, 8 months after the funeral. The road to the property was 2 ruts in the clay and took 45 minutes from the nearest paved road. There was no structure on the land. There was a view of several hundred square miles of plateau, red and grey and stripped down to something elemental, and the sky above it in the late afternoon going through 5 colors in quick succession. The Colorado Plateau at that altitude is not comfortable the way landscapes are comfortable when they have been organized for human habitation. It has been inhabited. It has been inhabited for a very long time, but it remains indifferent in a way that the city trains you out of recognizing. The silence had texture. The wind moved across sage and pinon in a way that was neither welcoming nor hostile, just present, the way something old is present when it has no interest in your particular moment. I set up a camp. I intended to stay a week. The first night, I found the pollen. I hadn't used the pouch from the tin box. I didn't know exactly what to do with it, and I was self-conscious about doing it wrong. But in the morning, I walked the perimeter of my camp and found a thin line of yellow pollen along the north side, placed at the base of the tent. Carefully, a continuous line that had not been there when I set up. The line was unbroken. Someone had laid it while I slept, or before I arrived. The second night, I used the pouch. I didn't know the proper words. I walked the perimeter of my camp and shook the pollen in a line along the ground, all 4 sides, the way I imagined it should go. I felt half foolish doing it, and half something else that I didn't have a word for. The feeling of doing something that has a grammar you haven't fully learned, but whose weight you can feel. In the morning, the north line was disturbed, not blown away. There was no wind that night. Swept is the word. Swept aside in a section about 2 feet wide, as if someone had pulled their hand through it deliberately, breaking the continuity. Only the north side. The other 3 were intact. I sat with that for most of the morning. I had driven 4 hours alone to a piece of land my grandmother had kept secret for 30 years. And on my second night, someone had carefully removed a section of a protective line around my camp. Either someone else was out here on this remote plateau, which was possible, but felt wrong in ways I couldn't explain, or the line had been tested and found and broken deliberately in the night. I took out my grandmother's card. I had my translation by then, typed on my phone from when I'd had a friend go over the Navajo. The price of our return. Be careful what you do with it. I had done some reading in the months since the funeral. Not deep reading, not the kind of reading that makes you fluent in something, but enough to understand more than I had. I read about the long walk. I read about what happened at Bosque Redondo. 4 years of imprisonment on land that wasn't theirs, in conditions that were designed to break the DNA people in a way the gunfire hadn't managed. When they were allowed to return in 1868, they came back changed. Some of them were changed in ways you'd expect, diminished, traumatized. The word isn't adequate, but some of them were changed in other ways. The elders knew. The elders had ways of reading what a person carried back. I'd read one account from a researcher working in the 1930s, recording oral histories of a family that returned from Fort Sumner with one fewer child than they'd left with, and something else that walked in that child's place. The family knew. They didn't speak of it. Something else lived among them for 2 generations. My grandmother had been the great-granddaughter of someone who came back from Fort Sumner. She had never told me more than that. She had kept a tin box on a shelf and moved it with her everywhere she went and left it to my mother, who left it to me. Be careful what you do with it. I relayed the pollen line that evening. I did it more carefully, slower, more continuous. I said what I could remember of what I'd read. I was aware of how inadequate this was. I was aware that I was a person who had grown up in Denver with a grandmother who kept secrets on a shelf, and I was standing on a high desert plateau in the last light, trying to speak a language I had never been taught. I finished the line. I went to bed. At some point in the night, I woke to silence. Not the normal silence of that place. The wind always had something to say, and the plateau at night has a particular sound that I'd been sleeping inside for 5 days without registering it as sound until it stopped. This was nothing. The total cessation of everything ambient. I lay still inside the tent and listened to nothing. After a long time, I can't say how long, I didn't check the time and I didn't move. I heard something at the north side of the tent. Not a footstep, not a voice. A very careful, deliberate sound, like a finger drawn slowly across a surface, specifically along the ground at the north edge of the camp, the pollen line. The north section. Again. I did not open the tent. I lay on my back with my eyes open in the dark, and I thought about my grandmother. I thought about what she knew that she chose not to pass on, and what that choice had cost her, and what it meant that she had passed on the pouch and the card and the turquoise and the folded paper instead, as if these were the words of a language she couldn't speak aloud. I thought about the long walk, about what gets carried back from a place where every ordinary human thing has been taken from you, about what a person might decide in those conditions is worth the cost of power. Whatever was at the north edge of the tent worked at the pollen line for a while, and then stopped. I heard nothing after. In the morning, the north section was swept aside again, exactly the same place as before. I packed my camp. I drove back to the paved road. I called no one. There was no cell signal until I reached Cortez. By then, I had driven a long time in silence and did not know who I would call or what I would say. I have the tin box. I have the pouch, which is maybe a third empty now. I have begun to learn, slowly and imperfectly and too late, the things my grandmother knew. She had kept that land for 30 years. She had paid for it and paid the taxes and never told anyone. I don't think she was waiting to use it. I think she was watching it, making sure that what she knew was there stayed contained in a place she could account for. When she moved from the reservation to Farmington and then to Denver, she took the box with her. She did not take the land. She did not let the land go either. I've been thinking about what that means, about what it costs to watch something across 30 years, about why she chose Denver and the distance and still kept paying the taxes. I went back in October. The drive was longer because I stopped in Cortez for supplies and because I drove more slowly than I had in June. The land was different in the fall. The plateau going gold and ochre in the scrub oak and serviceberry along the higher drainages, the sky that hard winter blue. I stayed 4 days. I relayed the pollen line every morning, the north side first. I slept better than I had in June, which I chose to interpret as a sign of something. On the second day, I unfolded the paper from the tin box for the first time. I won't say what was written there. I will say that it is in my grandmother's handwriting and that she wrote it about herself, and that it is the most frightening thing I have ever read. I have been learning since then, as quickly as I can, the things she knew. There are people who can teach some of it. Others I'm finding in books and records, in the fragments that have been written down by people working carefully in difficult circumstances. It is slow work, and I am starting very late. But I understand now what the tin box was. It was not just a record. It was a warning, and a set of tools, and an instruction that she could not speak aloud. She passed it to my mother because she couldn't explain it. My mother passed it to me for the same reason. The explanation is what I'm finally learning to give, and that I understand now why she watched the land from a distance, why she kept paying the taxes for 30 years from a house in Denver, why she moved the tin box with her every time she moved. The land required watching. The watching required distance. She had found the exact distance that kept both things true, and why she never went back. I worked for the Bureau of Land Management for 11 years, managing a district on the Arizona Strip, the country north of the Grand Canyon, south of the Utah border, between the Kaibab Plateau and the Nevada line. If you've never been there, it's hard to explain what it feels like. It's one of the most remote inhabited areas in the contiguous United States. The nearest city is Las Vegas, 4 hours. The nearest town with a full grocery store is St. George, 3 hours north. Most of the residents are ranchers with family that goes back generations on that land, and they are not people who advertise their presence to outsiders. I mention all this because the figure I saw was not a person who had wandered in. Nobody wanders into the Arizona Strip. You don't end up there. You go there or you don't. My station was a trailer at the end of a BLM access road, 22 miles from the nearest pavement. I had a truck, a radio, and a satellite phone for when the radio failed, which it did in spring thunderstorms, and sometimes for no reason at all. My nearest colleague was stationed 40 miles east, and we checked in twice a day, morning and evening, on the radio. I worked alone most of the time. I preferred it. The work that summer was monitoring a fencing project on the north end of my district. A long stretch of new fence along a grazing allotment boundary, about 8 miles. The fencing crew came in during the week and went home on weekends. On weekends, the strip goes back to just itself. I first saw the figure on a Friday night in early July. I was sitting outside my trailer after dark. Heat doesn't break until around 10 out there, and the inside the trailer at 9 p.m. is like a slow oven, in a folding chair, watching the sky do what the sky does on clear nights when there's no light for 30 miles. I had a headlamp and a book, and I wasn't really reading. I was watching. The figure was at the edge of where my porch light reached, standing, facing me, arms at its sides. I did not react with alarm immediately. My first thought was, a rancher. One of the Lawson family, maybe, whose grazing allotment ran along the east side of my district. They came and went on their own schedules, and had done so for decades, before BLM had a presence out there. Sometimes they came by to flag an issue. I didn't know every face, but I knew enough of them. I called out, no response. I got up and took my headlamp. I walked toward the edge of the porch light, maybe 40 feet from my trailer door. The figure was still there when I reached that distance, still standing, still not responding to the light or my movement. At 40 feet, I could see it was a person, dressed in something dark. I couldn't pick out specifics in the headlamp's reach at that distance. Standing with both feet set and arms hanging straight. Not the posture of someone who has stopped to rest or is waiting comfortably. A very particular stillness, the kind of stillness that takes more effort than movement. I said, hello again. Nothing. I stopped moving toward it. Something about the stillness, a quality I couldn't articulate at the time and still struggle to articulate, made me stop before I'd made a conscious decision to stop. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling of stepping toward an edge and the body knowing before the mind does that this is where you stop. I stood there. The figure stood there. After a while, maybe 5 minutes, I backed up to my trailer, went inside, and locked the door. I watched through the small window for another half hour. The figure didn't move. In the morning, when I went outside, there was nothing there. I reported it on the morning radio check. My colleague didn't have anything useful. He said sometimes people tried to camp on BLM land without a permit and got lost, and if someone was disoriented, I should check the area on my ATV. I drove the perimeter of my station site for about an hour. I found no tracks, no camp, no vehicle on the access road in either direction. The clay out there is fine-grained and holds impressions well. There were no footprints near the trailer except my own. The second night, Saturday, same position, same stillness. I was inside the trailer this time, and I saw the figure through the window, at the edge of the porch light, at the same distance from the trailer as before, facing the door. I did not go out. I watched. The figure stood in that position for 3 hours. I know because I watched it, checking the clock, doing the calculations that feel useful when you are trying to manage something with your rational mind. From 9:47 p.m., when I first noticed it in the window, until 12:51 a.m., when I checked again and the position was empty. I couldn't see a face from inside. I couldn't see whether it was the same figure as the night before or not. What I could see was the same silhouette, the same posture, the same quality of stillness, arms at its sides, head oriented toward the door. Sunday night. I called my supervisor on the satellite phone before dark. I told him I'd had a suspicious person near my station 2 nights running, and I wanted guidance on how to handle it. He asked if I felt I was in danger. I said I didn't know. He said to document it and call the county sheriff if I needed law enforcement. I called the county sheriff. The deputy I reached was polite and unhelpful, in a way that means he understood something I didn't and didn't know how to say it. He said, "Call us if there's contact or damage to property." I said, "What if they're just standing there?" He said, "Call us if there's contact or damage." The third night, I counted steps. When I first saw the figure, I'd estimated it at 40 feet from my trailer door. I'd walk 40 feet to reach the edge of the porch light's reach. The first night, the Shuja figure was at that edge. The second night, I'd been watching from inside, but looking back at the window's angle and what I could see in the porch light's reach, the figure had been a little closer. Not by much, maybe 5 feet. The third night, from the window, I could see more detail than the second night. Not enough to describe, enough to know that the distance had closed again. I mapped it out on paper. First night, edge of light, approximately 40 feet. Second night, approximately 35 feet. Third night, approximately 30 feet. The approach was slow enough that you might not notice it if you weren't looking carefully. It had a patience to it that was worse than anything sudden would have been. I called my colleague at his home number that night. He'd been on the strip for 9 years. I described what I was seeing, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Don't go out to it. Whatever it does, stay inside." He said this specifically and carefully. He said, "Don't go toward it and don't make sounds that suggest you're aware of it." I asked him what he thought it was. He said he'd tell me when I came in at the end of the week. Fourth night, Monday. It was closer. 20 feet, I estimated. I could see with the porch light that his head was oriented not at the door, but slightly to the left of the door, at the window I was watching from. I moved away from the window. Fifth night, I couldn't see it from the window. I turned off the interior lights and looked out into the darkness. It took my eyes a few minutes to adjust. When they did, I could see the shape of it just inside the reach of the porch light, 8, maybe 10 feet from my door, standing with the same arm down stillness. I did not move. I did not make a sound. I stayed as still as it was. I don't know how long I stood at the window in the dark. A long time. Long enough that my legs ached. I watched the shape at the edge of the light, and it watched the door, and neither of us moved. At some point before dawn, it wasn't there anymore. In the morning, I found the welcome mat at my door, a simple rubber mat I'd put there when I first moved in. Moved 3 feet to the left of where I kept it. The mat was the only thing out of place. Everything else was exactly as I'd left it. I drove to the district office on Tuesday morning without calling ahead. My supervisor asked what I was doing there. I told him I needed someone to cover my station for a few days. He looked at my face and didn't argue. My colleague took me for coffee at the diner in Colorado City. He asked me what had happened, and I described it. The distances, the nightly advance, the stillness, the mat. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "It stopped coming closer." He said it like this was the relevant fact, not everything else I described, but this. I asked him what that meant. He said it meant either it decided to stop or it decided it had what it needed. I asked him which one he thought it was. He looked out the diner window for a while. He said he wasn't sure either answer was the better one. I transferred to a district in New Mexico the following spring. I told myself it was the career opportunity. I told myself the strip had been a good post and I'd done good work there, and it was time for a new challenge. I unpacked in a new town and set up a new trailer and put my welcome mat at the door and told myself I was fine. I don't leave the mat outside at night anymore. I don't leave anything outside at night. I've never told my current supervisor what happened out there. I've never written it into an official report. I filed the disturbance as an unresolved trespassing incident. No suspect identified, no contact made, no property damaged. That's accurate enough. What it doesn't capture is the fifth night. The shape at the edge of the light, 8 feet from my door, watching the window where I was standing. The sense I had, standing there in the dark, trying to be as still as it was, trying to give it nothing to orient on, that it was calculating something, that it had been calculating it for 4 nights, closing the distance in increments small enough not to trigger alarm, and that on the 5th night, it had arrived at whatever figure it was working toward, and then it had stopped. I've been trying to decide for 2 years now whether that's a comfort or not. My new district in New Mexico has its own history. Most of the Southwest does. I've been doing the work differently since the Arizona Strip. More attentive to what the land is doing around me, more willing to sit with an anomaly before trying to name it. My colleague, who told me to stay inside, has retired. I never had the conversation he promised. I don't know now if that information would have helped me or just sharpened what I already can't stop thinking about. What I know is that something came to the edge of my light 5 nights in a row and closed the distance by 5 feet each time. And on the 5th night, it stopped 8 feet from my door and stood there and waited and then left. And that the only thing that happened differently on the 5th night from the first 4 nights was that I stayed still and gave it nothing to measure. I keep this in mind. I should tell you what the sound of that place was before I tell you what it wasn't. The Harmon Ranch sat on about 4,000 acres of high desert basin east of Elko, sage country, bunch grass, a seasonal creek that ran clear in spring and went underground by June. The basin was rimmed on 3 sides by mountains that weren't dramatic but were permanent and useful. They broke the wind in certain directions, and they told you where you were when you couldn't see the road. At night the coyotes worked the creek margins, and the elk came down from the higher country, and the whole system made a kind of noise that wasn't silence, even when it was quiet. You could hear the difference between the absence of obvious sound and actual quiet. Place had a bass line. I'm a working hand. I've contracted for ranches across Nevada and eastern Oregon for 15 years, mostly cattle and some sheep. The Harmon Ranch was 2 seasons of work, fall roundup and fencing the first year, a longer spring season the second year when they were moving a herd up to the summer grazing allotment in the mountains. I liked the work. I liked the country. I don't romanticize the desert, but I understand how to read it. Reading it is what matters here. The first time the silence happened was in late October of my first season, maybe 3 weeks in. I'd been putting in fence posts along the northeast pasture boundary most of the afternoon. Hard caliche soil, the kind that resists the auger and reminds you it's not interested in being worked. By about 6:30 the light was going and I was packing up the ATV. The sound stopped. Not gradually, not the way sound fades when a wind drops or the temperature shifts. It stopped like a hand placed over a speaker. The coyotes that had been running along the creek a quarter-mile east went quiet mid-call. The crickets in the sage. And there had been a heavy cricket presence that day. The warm autumn kind just stopped. The whole ambient layer of that basin went down to nothing in about 1 second. I stood next to the ATV with my hand on the tailgate, and I listened to nothing. The immediate reaction was practical. You've lost reference. Figure out why. I did a quick scan. The wind had been from the south all day and was still moving through the sage. I could see the plants moving, but the sound of the wind wasn't there either. The mountains were exactly where they'd been. The sky was the orange and grey of early dusk. Nothing was wrong that I could see. I thought, atmospheric pressure, weather coming. There are conditions where the air does strange things with sound. I've seen it happen. I accepted this and finished loading the tools. When I started the ATV engine, the sound came back. Coyotes, crickets, wind, like a switch turned on. I noted it as a strange weather effect and drove back to the bunkhouse. What I told myself at the time, the pressure, explanation, the weather effect, was not a lie exactly. It was the explanation that fit within the framework I had. Every working hand develops a framework for the land they work, a way of accounting for what happens there. And mine had never needed a category for the kind of total cessation I'd just experienced. So I put it in the closest available category and moved on. This is what you do. It takes a few more incidents before you understand that the category is wrong. Second time was 2 nights later at the barn. I was doing a late check on one of the horses that had been favoring a front left. A routine check, nothing urgent. The barn at night has its own sounds. The horses moving, the rustling of hay, the occasional creak of the structure settling. This is a comfortable sound. I've worked around horses my whole adult life, and the sounds they make are a language I understand. Silence, same quality as before, dropped out of the air like a stone. The horses went silent too. And this is the part I want to be careful about. Because horses stop moving for reasons, and this is something a working hand knows. They stop when they're sick, or in pain, or frightened. I had 6 horses in that barn, and all of them went still at once. They were looking at the east wall, not at each other, not at me. All 6 of them oriented the same direction, toward the east wall of the barn, which faced the pasture I'd been fencing. Their ears were forward and rigid. Their nostrils were moving, but they weren't making sound. I went to the east wall and looked through the slat window that runs about 4 feet above the floor. The pasture was dark. The moon wasn't up yet, and the stars were out, and I could see maybe 70 feet. At the edge of what I could see, at the far limit of whatever light the stars provided, not quite visible enough to describe, something was standing in the pasture, a shape, upright, still. I stood at that window for a long time. The silence held. The horses held their position, ears forward, watching the wall. The shape at the edge of my vision didn't move. It was too far out, and the night was too dark for me to make out anything specific. Height, posture, whether it was a person or an animal, or something my eyes were building out of shadows. What I could say is that it was there and that it wasn't moving. I'm not the kind of person who gets rattled by an unknown in the dark. I've encountered coyotes and elk and once a black bear on a ridge in Oregon, and none of those encounters required me to stay at a window watching and doing nothing. But I stayed at that window and did nothing. I don't know how long it stood there. Time is difficult to track when your body has gone into a particular kind of waiting. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe longer. At some point, I noticed it was gone before I could say it had moved. The pasture was empty. The silence continued for another minute or two, and then the crickets came back, and one of the horses breathed out long and heavy, and the barn went back to what a barn is. I told Emilio in the morning. He was the one other permanent hand on the property at that time, a man who'd been working ranches in Nevada and northern Utah for more years than I had. He listened to the description of the silence and the shape at the pasture edge without interrupting. He said, "You didn't go out toward it." I said no. He nodded. He didn't say anything else about it. He went back to his breakfast. I asked him a few days later whether he'd ever experienced something like that on this property or on others. We were mending fence on the south pasture. He worked for a while without answering, which is not unusual for Emilio. He doesn't speak quickly. He said he'd been on a ranch in Utah once where the same thing happened. The silence, the animals going still and looking in one direction. Something at the edge of what you could see that wasn't there when you looked harder. I asked him what he thought it was. He said the rancher he'd worked for in Utah had some Navajo neighbors. Good people, he said, the kind who knew what they were doing. The rancher had asked them about it when it happened 3 times in one summer. They told him, "Don't engage with it. Don't look directly if you can help it. Don't go toward it. If you can, put something across the doors. Salt, ash, something with protection in it," though Emilio didn't know the specifics. They'd said the most important thing was the silence. They'd said to treat the silence as the warning, not whatever follows it, because by the time you can see what follows the silence, you are already behind. Emilio told me he'd started carrying cedar ash in a small cloth pouch in his coat pocket. He'd been doing this for 4 years. He didn't know if it worked. He said the doing of it was the point. He said the worst thing you could do was what most people's instincts told them to do. Go toward it. Call out. Try to get a better look. I thought about the horses all facing the east wall. I thought about standing at the slat window for 20 minutes, watching a shape that never moved. I thought about the moment when I realized the shape was gone. Not the moment it left, which I didn't catch, but the moment I noticed the absence. How long had it already been gone by then? I asked Emilio what they'd said it was. It was quiet for a while. Then he said, "They didn't say. They talked around what it was." The rancher told Emilio later that he'd gotten the impression the neighbors were careful about naming it specifically because naming it was its own kind of risk. He said, "I got the same impression that knowing too much, saying too much, invites attention in a way that not knowing doesn't." He went back to the fence post he was set in. I finished my second season at the Harmon Ranch in late June. I heard the silence 4 more times that year. Each time I stayed where I was, looked at something other than the edge of my vision where I thought the shape might be, and waited for it to pass. I carry cedar ash now, a small cloth pouch, coat pocket. I started 3 years ago. I can't tell you with certainty that this shape was what I think it was. I can't tell you that the cedar ash does anything. What I can tell you is that I've been reading that desert basin for 2 seasons, that I know what its baseline sounds like, and that the silence that preceded each of those moments was not weather, not atmospheric pressure, not anything I'd ever encountered in 15 years of working that country. The last time it happened, in my second spring, I was out on the north fence at dusk, and the silence came down, and I stopped and looked at the ground instead of the horizon, the way Emilio had told me to. I counted the fence posts I'd set that day. I listened to nothing. I waited. After a while, the crickets came back. I drove back to the bunkhouse. I didn't look at the pasture edge. I'd like to tell you that was an act of courage. Honestly, I'm not sure what it was. There's a version of it that's just this. I knew by then that looking didn't give me anything useful, and not looking was the only rule I had, and the one advantage I had over the first time was knowing the rule. Some warnings you only get once. I was lucky enough to get mine more slowly. What I want to say to anyone who finds themselves in a similar position is this. The silence is diagnostic, not the shape at the edge of your vision, not the animals pointing in one direction, not any of the things that follow. The silence. By the time you can see or hear what comes after the silence, you have already missed the warning. The silence is the warning. Whatever Emilio's contact understood, this was the core of it. Learn to read the quiet before it stops being quiet. And when it stops, stay where you are. That's the whole rule. I have been living by it for 3 years and I've been fine. I think I've been fine because of the rule. I can't prove that, but I keep the rule anyway. I went to Animas in late February, just after the winter rains. The county social services office covers a large geographic area with a small staff, and the home visits in the far southern reaches of the county get scheduled when they can be scheduled, which in winter means whenever the roads are dry enough and whoever is available as a block of time. I drew the Animas run 3 times that year. This account is from the second. The client I was visiting, I'll call her Mrs. A, was an elderly woman living alone, native to that part of New Mexico, who had been referred to us by a distant relative after a fall. She declined inpatient care, and the referral was for wellness checks and to assess whether the living situation was safe. I had visited once before in the fall. She was in good health for her age, sharp, and the house was well maintained. She had not asked for any of this. She was tolerating it. Anima sits at about 4,000 feet, in a valley between the Pelonchillo and Pyramid Mountains, 7 miles north of the Mexican border. The town proper is less than 100 people. The surrounding ranches extend miles in every direction. There's a post office, a fire station, and not much else. In February, the valley is cold and brown, and the mountains still hold snow above 5,000 feet. The drive south from Lordsburg on the 2-lane is 35 miles of open country, with nothing on either side except cattle fencing and occasional ranch gates. I mention the geography because it explains the silence. It's the kind of silence that has weight, not the comfortable silence of interior space, but the open country silence of extreme distance from everything. By the time I pulled into Mrs. A's driveway, I was carrying about 40 miles of that silence with me. There is a particular quality to communities that sit at the edge of everything, near a border, near a reservation boundary, near land that has been contested and coded and recoded by different governments across centuries. The community around Animas has this quality. The people there have a relationship to the landscape that is neither romantic nor anxious. It is long. The kind of long that means they have already seen most things and have developed over generations ways of living alongside what doesn't resolve. My professional frame, the form, the welfare assessment, the standardized questions, was the right tool for what I was trained to do. It was not designed for the country I was driving through. She met me at the door as she had before, dressed, composed, the particular dignity of someone who has been attending to her own affairs for a long time and finds the visits an imposition she's elected to accept with grace. We went through the standard questions. Her health was unchanged. The fall had left no lasting damage. She showed me the repair she'd had done on the porch step that had caused it. I noted the health, information, did the standard walkthrough, noted no concerns. We had tea. We talked about the spring rains and whether they'd been enough for the grass. As I was leaving, I stopped at the edge of the porch. There was a tarantula hole at the base of the porch steps. This is not unusual in southern New Mexico. Burrowing tarantulas are common, and their holes are distinctive. A clean round opening, about 1.5 inches in diameter, often with a thin silk lining visible at the rim. I've seen them on every rural property in this part of the county. This one had something inside it. I crouched down to look. At the entrance to the hole, pushed partway in, was a small piece of something wrapped in cord. Red cord, wound many times. And from the gap at the top of the wrapping, partially visible, what appeared to be a small quantity of dark hair. I reached toward it without thinking. "Don't touch that." Mrs. A was standing in a doorway behind me. She had come out without my hearing her. Her voice was the same as always, composed, quiet. But the words were clipped in a way that stopped me mid-reach. I straightened and looked at her. She looked at the hole. She looked at me. There was a long moment of assessment. She said, "Leave it where it is. Don't disturb it." I asked her what it was. She said, "Sit down." We sat back on the porch. She was quiet for a while. I had my notepad in my hand, and then I put it away because the notepad was wrong for whatever she was about to say. She said that what was in the hole was a curse object, cord and pottery and something personal. Hair, usually, or a nail clipping, or a scrap of clothing. She said this was done to cause sickness and death in the person whose belonging was inside. She said she had found it that morning. She said she knew whose hair it was. She told me it was hers. I went through my professional frame automatically. I asked whether she knew who might have placed it. I asked whether she had concerns about anyone in the community. I said the words that the frame requires because the frame is all I had. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "You're going to write something down that doesn't help me. And I understand that. And I don't hold it against you." She told me what she knew. There was a woman in the community, she would not say who had been in a dispute with Mrs. A over land that had been her late husband's. The dispute had gone on for years. The normal channels, county deeds, negotiation, even an attempt at legal resolution had not resolved it. At some point, she said, the woman had decided to take a different path. She said, "There are people who know how to do this." She said it the way you state a fact about the physical world, not with conviction or belief as an argument, but as description. There are people who know how to do this, the way there are people who know how to do anything. She said her husband, before he died, had gotten sick this way. 7 months of an illness no doctor in Lordsburg or Deming or Silver City could name. He'd lost 40 pounds. He'd lost his ability to sleep. He'd had a pain in his side that moved around and never resolved, and that the doctors had theories about and no answers for. He died in the 7th month. After he died, she had found an object near the foundation of the house. She described it the same way. Cord, pottery, something personal from inside. She said, "They'll tell you this can't work. The doctors will. I'm not asking you to believe it works. I'm telling you what happened to my husband. I'm telling you what I found this morning at the base of my steps. I'm telling you I know whose hair is in that cord." I sat with this for a moment. I asked her what she was going to do. She said there were people who could help with this. She had already made a call. Someone was coming. She said, "The important thing is that you don't disturb it before they arrive. If you disturb it, you take responsibility for what happens." She said this with the same directness she'd said everything else, and I understood from her tone that she was not asking me to believe in consequences I couldn't verify. She was asking me to leave something alone that was not mine, which is a reasonable request. I said I would leave it alone. I drove back to Lordsburg. In the car, I went through the visit in my professional mind. No evidence of cognitive decline. She was entirely coherent. No evidence of danger to herself. She was handling the situation with evident competence. No indication of fear, actually, now that I thought about it. She'd been angry, in the controlled way of someone who knows anger is a waste of time and is conserving it. She'd been practical. She'd already made a call. I drove the 35 miles of open country back to the highway. I thought about the cord and the pottery and the hair. I thought about her husband's 7-month illness and the object near the foundation afterward. I have been going back and forth since then on what I believe. I was trained in evidence-based practice. I was trained to distinguish between the real distress of a client and the framework they use to interpret that distress, and to address the distress without necessarily validating the framework. This framing feels insufficient for what I saw on that porch. Not because I have decided the tarantula hole curse is real. But because Mrs. A had lived in that valley for more than 80 years, and her husband had died of an illness that no doctor could name, and something had been placed at the base of her steps, a deliberate, careful, constructed thing, by someone who intended it as harm. Whatever the mechanism, the intent was not ambiguous. The intent was real, and the outcome was real. She was ill. She recovered. She attributed her recovery to the intervention of someone who understood what had been done and knew how to address it. I cannot confirm that causal chain through any institutional method available to me, but I also cannot account for her husband's death, or the object near his foundation, or the object near her steps, or the clarity with which an 80-year-old woman with no apparent cognitive decline described all of it. The clinical frame handles some of this, and not all of it. I've been sitting with the part it doesn't handle for a long time. I made a third visit in April. The house was the same. Mrs. A was in the garden. The tarantula hole at the base of the steps was empty, clean swept around the opening, the way the ground around it was before. Whatever had been there was gone. I asked her how she was. She said, better. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. We went through the wellness check. I noted her health as good. I noted no concerns. I drove back north with the valley behind me, and the Peloncillos going small in the mirror, and the 40 miles of open country settling back into silence. I closed the case 6 months later, when she declined to renew the welfare check authorization. She was fine, she said. She didn't need checking on. I believed her. What I carry from those visits isn't the tarantula hole exactly. It's the particular tone of her voice when she said, there are people who know how to do this. Not with fear, not even with anger, fully, just with the exhausted precision of someone describing the world as it is, to someone who has been trained to believe the world is otherwise. She was more patient with me than I deserved. What I carry from those visits, beyond the tarantula hole and the question of mechanism and the two things that remain permanently unanswerable, is the quality of her patience. The way she waited for me to catch up to what she already knew. The way she described everything clearly and without hurry, and without the expectation that I would be equipped to meet it. This is the particular patience of someone who has been explaining the world to people who weren't trained for it for a very long time. These are the field notes of Ars y Castellano, recorded over 12 days in October at Navajo and Hopi ancestral territory in northern Arizona. The project working title was The Cartography of Fear, How Rural Communities Organize Around Shared Belief. Day 1 arrived at the campground at 5 p.m. Off-season, so no staff. Self-registration at the kiosk. I am one of 3 campers currently in residence across a site designed for perhaps 30. The other 2 are in a camper van at the far end of the loop, evidently retired couple from Colorado. The nearest occupied site to mine is the length of 2 football fields. This is good for the work. Isolation encourages a different kind of thinking than I can do in an office. The purpose of this research day is observation and collection of oral history. I have arranged 6 interviews through contacts made via the University Extension Office. The interviews will not start until day 3. Tonight, I settle in. The air here smells like juniper and cold stone, and something I don't have a word for. I'm going to try to get language right on this trip. That's a discipline the work requires. Day 2. Spend the day driving the region, reorienting myself to the geography. I was here briefly in 2019 for a conference, and remembered it as vast in a way that my memory had flattened into something manageable. It is not manageable. The plateau stretches in every direction without organizing itself for human convenience. The roads are real, but they feel provisional, laid over something that isn't interested in roads. I know how that sounds. I'm a researcher. But you do the work better if you let the landscape in, rather than keeping it at analytical distance. Day 3, first interview. I'll call the subject TH, a man in his late 60s, Navajo, retired teacher. We spoke for 2 hours at his kitchen table. I asked TH about the community's relationship to the figure I'm studying. He was willing to talk about it in general terms, its place in the culture, its function as a social enforcer, the cultural protocols around discussing it. He was not willing to be specific. He said, the more precisely you name it, the more you are addressing it. And you don't want to address something you don't intend to be in a conversation with. I wrote this down as a specimen of the belief structure. I did not think about it much. Day 4, second and third interviews. Both productive, patterns emerging. The belief is consistent across generations and across levels of formal education. The highly educated subjects are not more skeptical than the elders. If anything, the opposite. The ones who have left and come back are the most careful. I had dinner at the camp stove. Chili from a can, not glorious. The stars here are genuinely something. I've been to dark sky places before, but the altitude and the absence of any horizon lighting does something that I haven't experienced. Slept well. Day 5. Nothing to note in the field. Writing up interview notes. Day 6. Third interview ran over by 90 minutes. Subject: a woman I'll call PW, Navajo, early 50s. She works in healthcare administration and was the most analytical of my subjects so far in terms of how she framed the belief system. I expected her to create critical distance. She did not. She said, people think the education changes what you believe. It doesn't change what you know. I've seen things. My colleagues have seen things. We document them or we don't. And what we document is what the institutional context allows us to document, but that's a recording problem, not a reality problem. I found this formulation striking. I'm using it in the chapter on epistemology. She asked where I was camping. When I told her the campground, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "Be careful about what you leave outside overnight." I said, "Like gear? Weather?" She said, "Like anything." I didn't ask her to explain. The interview moved on. I wrote down the exchange and noted, follow up on outdoor precautions, practical or belief-based. Day 7. Morning was clear and cold. I made coffee and was doing notes when I saw the powder. It was on the tent floor, the outside of the tent, the ground cloth that extends 6 inches past the tent opening. A thin layer of fine white powder spread in a rough circle around the entrance. Not uniform, thicker in some spots, lighter in others, like it had been scattered from above rather than poured. My first thought was, a bird. I've had birds drop things on gear before. I looked up. No branches above the tent. No roosting spot within range. My second thought was, ash from a fire. The Colorado couple had a fire pit 200 yards away. I checked the wind direction from the night before on my weather app. It had been from the northwest, not from their direction. Also, the powder was inside the circle, not blown in a directional pattern. I crouched down and looked at the powder without touching it. It was very fine, almost a dust, not charcoal ash. That has a particular coarse texture, not salt or sand, something finer, whiter, that I couldn't identify by sight. I got a small sample bag from my kit and collected a portion of it. I took photographs from multiple angles. Then I swept the rest away from the tent entrance and went back to my coffee. I wrote it up in my field notes as an anomalous finding, classification pending. I was pleased with myself for the clinical approach. I photographed the area. I had the sample. I moved on. That evening, I called PW to schedule the follow-up I'd been meaning to arrange. After we confirmed the time, I mentioned that I had found an unusual powder around my tent that morning. I described it. There was a silence on the line. She asked if I'd touched it. I said I'd taken a sample. She said, "Were your bare hands?" I said yes. She was quiet again. Then she said, "I want you to listen to me." She said it in the voice she'd used when she said the thing about the recording problem, not urgent, but without hedging. She said, "Wash your hands. Wash them thoroughly. Do not put the sample bag inside the tent. Leave it outside." I asked her why. She said there was a practice. She named it as something associated with the figure I was studying, of using ground material from human remains, particularly infants, as a targeted agent. She said it was scattered where a specific person would contact it, and that contact was the beginning of the harm, not the end. She said this directly and without what I'd come to recognize as the hedging that the topic usually produced. I said, "We're describing it as if it's real." She said, "I'm describing what it is." I washed my hands. I put the sample bag on the picnic table outside. I sat in the tent with a lantern on, and I looked at my clean hands, and I thought about the powder. I thought about the fact that I had arrived at that campsite as one of 3 vehicles in a facility built for 30, and the other 2 campers were a retired couple 200 yards away in a sealed van. I thought about the fact that the powder had been placed around my tent specifically, not around the van, not scattered randomly across the campground, around mine. I thought about TH saying, the more precisely you name it, the more you are addressing it. I thought about PW saying, it's not a recording problem, it's a reality problem. I thought about the sample bag sitting on the picnic table in the dark outside, and whether moving it back outside had been the right call, and where outside was far enough. Day 8. I slept badly. I'm recording that in the notes because it may be relevant, or may simply be that I lay awake thinking too hard about things that disturb me when I look at them directly. Nothing around the tent in the morning. No powder, no disruption. Day 9. I moved campsites. I told myself it was to get better light for the morning writing. This is not why I moved. I moved because I wanted to put 200 yards of open ground between myself and the place where the powder had been. I know this is not distance that matters if the thing being discussed is real. I moved anyway. Day 10. Interview with an elder I'll call FN. He is in his 80s and was willing to speak with me on the condition that I not record. I agreed. I asked him about the powder. I described what I'd found. He looked at me for a long time. He said, "You understand you've been noticed." I said, "Noticed by what?" He said, "By whatever is paying attention to you." He said the appropriate response was not to panic and not to investigate further. He said the investigation was likely the problem, not what I'd written, not what I'd published, but the act of asking people to speak precisely about this thing. He said, "You've been gathering descriptions of it. In some traditions, description is a form of attention, and attention is a two-way process." He said I should go home. Day 11. I did not go home. I wrote up my interview notes and continued my fieldwork. I am trained to maintain methodological discipline in the face of material that challenges my assumptions. I maintained it. But I left the sample bag on the picnic table in a sealed Ziploc with a rock on top of it, and I washed my hands again that evening before I made dinner, and I slept with the tent zipped from the inside in a way I don't normally bother with, because I'm usually the only person in a campsite. Day 12. Final day. Nothing around the tent the previous 3 nights. I packed up this morning. I left the sample bag on the table rather than putting it in the car. I'm not sure that was right. I'm not sure what right is in this situation. I've been trained in evidence collection. Leaving evidence is not something I do, but this particular evidence, the powder, the fact of it, the fact that it was specific to my campsite, did not feel like something I should carry home with me. I left it and I drove. I drove north towards Flagstaff, and I've been thinking, for the 4 hours since I left the campground, about FN's phrase, "You've been noticed." I don't believe what he believes. That's still true. I'm trained in critical evaluation of folk belief, in the distinction between what communities believe and what can be empirically demonstrated. The training doesn't evaporate because someone puts powder at the door of your tent. But I've been thinking about another distinction, the one PW named, between what can be recorded and what is real, between the institutional context that shapes what gets documented and the thing itself, which doesn't care whether it's been documented. The powder was there. Someone put it there specifically. Someone knew I was in that campground, in that specific site, and placed something outside my tent in the night. I don't have a framework for what comes next. I keep thinking about FN's face when he told me to go home. Not urgent, not afraid, patient. The way someone looks at you when they've already been through what you haven't started yet. Heading home. I have been 4 hours on the highway, and I'm still thinking about FN's face when he told me to leave. Not urgent, not afraid. The particular patience of someone who has said what they know and is waiting, with no expectations, to see what the other person does with it. Dear Celia, I'm writing this by hand because I want it to be a letter and not a text message, and also because I'm in a part of Colorado where my phone does almost nothing useful, the San Luis Valley south of Alamosa. You've heard me mention it. The high basin, the mountains on 3 sides, the UFO reports that nobody who lives here finds interesting anymore. I'm staying at the Gaza Ranch for the winter, doing what I do, and I've been wanting to write you something proper for a month. I'm well. The altitude is not a problem anymore, which surprised me. I thought the 1,100-foot jump from Albuquerque would take longer to adjust to. The cold is significant. This valley in January is a different proposition than what I grew up with. The valley is unlike anywhere I've worked before. Most of my winter stays are in the southwest proper. Taos, Gallup, once as far north as Durango. The San Luis Valley sits at a different elevation and holds a different quality of cold, the kind that comes from being enclosed on all sides and catches the wind differently. The mountains around it are not distant the way mountains are distant in the desert. They are close and present, a wall that holds the basin in. At night, the cold comes down from them and settles into the flatland and doesn't move until the sun is well up. The Garza family has been here since the land grant era. Elena's grandmother was born in this valley. The family has always kept horses, and they have always known this land in the way that people know land, when every generation has worked the same soil. Elena herself has the specific unhurriedness of someone who has never needed to explain themselves to the place they live. I find this quality restful to be around. It is the opposite of how I sometimes feel. Let me tell you about the horses first, because that's what started my thinking. The Garza family runs cattle primarily, but they have 3 horses they keep for working the pasture. Good horses, experienced animals, the kind that know the property better than a map could tell you. Elena Garza has had 2 of them for over a decade. They know this land. About 3 weeks after I arrived, I noticed that none of the 3 horses would cross the north fence line into the adjacent pasture. Not would not. Could not is closer. If you walked one toward the gate in the north fence, they'd stop about 6 feet short and plant. No amount of encouragement moved them. They were not frightened in the way a horse is frightened of something seen. That's a different quality of response, all legs and neck. This was a steady, resolved refusal, like a wall they could feel, and you couldn't. I asked Elena about it. She said it had started in the fall, maybe October, and she'd assumed at first it was something in the grass, a smell from something dead in the north pasture maybe, or some change in the ground. She'd walked the north pasture herself and found nothing. The horses still wouldn't cross. She said it the way she says most things, which is without drama. Elena Garza is a woman who's been running a ranch in a high-altitude valley in southern Colorado for 40 years. She does not attach drama to phenomena that she cannot immediately explain. I walked the north pasture myself on a clear afternoon. The ground was frozen and the grass was flat and brown, and there was nothing visibly wrong with it. But I walked it for an hour, and I won't tell you what I felt. The northwest corner is bounded on one side by an old stock tank. Metal, rust-colored, long empty. The tank sits at the far edge of the corner, and the ground around it is packed harder than the rest of the pasture, the way ground gets when something heavy has stood in one spot across many seasons. I walked around the tank. I walked the fence line. I walked back toward the center of that corner. The quality I'm trying to describe is not dramatic. I've been in places where something violent happened and you can feel it. That's a different and more recognizable thing. This was subtler. The air in that northwest acre was still in a way the rest of the pasture wasn't, even though the wind was moving across the whole basin without obstruction. Something about that section held itself separate from what surrounded it. I stood in the middle of it for a few minutes, trying to locate whether there was a center, a specific spot where the quality was most concentrated. I think there was. I think it was close to the tank. I didn't stay there long, which is that there was a quality to one section of the North Pasture, about an acre, maybe less, in the northwest corner near the old stock tank, that made me not want to stay in it, not frightened, not alarmed, something quieter. The desire to finish whatever I was doing there and be finished. I finished. I left the northwest corner. I felt fine. Celia, you've known me long enough to know I don't write sentences like that lightly. You've known me since the clinic in Gallup, and you know what I think about the balance between what I was trained in and what I practice, and where the two don't agree. I'm going to write you something now that I couldn't put in a professional report. I'm writing it to you because you're the person I trust with this particular kind of honesty. I've been studying healing for 20 years, not just the clinical side. You know this about me. The older knowledge as well. The knowledge of what moves through people and how you work with it. I've spent time with people who understand the full spectrum of that knowledge, both the work that heals and the work that harms. I've been near the second kind of knowledge without going into it. I know what it feels like to stand near a line you don't cross. I've felt it before, and I felt it in that northwest corner. What I felt was that something had been done there, not long ago. Months, I think, rather than years. Something deliberate, and deliberate in a specific direction. The ground held it the way ground can hold things that have been pressed into it with intention. I didn't tell Elena this. What I told her was I'd keep the horses away from the North Pasture for now and watch whether anything changed in the spring. She said she'd do that anyway. She was already doing that. I've been thinking since then about the person who would have done this. And I want to be honest with you about what I think, because you're the only person I can be honest with about this. I think it was someone who knows this valley, someone with roots here. And this valley has roots that go centuries deep, Spanish and indigenous and everything that's woven together across that time. Someone who learned the knowledge I've spent 20 years learning, and learned some of it in a different direction. The valley is small. The ranching community is tight. I've met most of the people who live and work here within the first few weeks of my stay. I have a list in my mind of who it could be, and it is not a short list, but it is not a long one either. There is a particular feeling to knowing that someone you've eaten with, spoken to in the ordinary way of a small community, has made the choice I'm describing. Not the dramatic revelation of it. Most things are not dramatic in the way we hope they will be, so that we can name them clearly. Just a quiet recalibration, the way you replay conversations and look for what you missed. The way a face in memory shifts slightly when you know what to look for. I have this feeling about someone in this valley. I've been sitting with it for weeks now. I haven't named it to myself completely, because naming it makes it permanent in a way that suspicion is not. What I know, what I can say without naming, is that the northwest corner of the North Pasture was worked deliberately. The horses are not wrong. Animals are not wrong about these things. And the particular kind of wrongness they refuse is something that I can recognize after 20 years of practice. I have stood near both sides of the knowledge. I know what the other side smells like. What I keep coming back to is the choice, not the act itself, but the choice that preceded it, the decision to use what you know in that direction. I have stood near that decision myself at moments in my life when I was angry enough or hurt enough that the knowledge of how to do harm became live in my mind in a different way than it usually is. I didn't cross that line. I'm not writing this to take credit for that. I'm writing it because I think about what would have been different if I had, what I would have become, what the difference is between a healer and the other thing, and how much of that difference is intention and how much is just circumstances being slightly other than they were. There's a word for what I'm describing. You know what it is? I'm not going to write it, not in a letter that will travel through mail systems and sit in your kitchen for a while. But you know, and what I've been sitting with, here in this cold valley with the mountains close on three sides, is that knowledge is the same. What I have learned and what they have learned is the same body of knowledge, divided at a fork that was probably not as dramatic as it sounds from outside. A choice made at a particular moment, at a particular level of pain or greed, or just the desire for a power that healing alone can't provide. I'm not afraid of the northwest corner of the North Pasture. I'm not afraid of whoever did this, not the way fear usually presents. What I feel is something more like the stillness that comes before you make a decision you know you can't unmake. I think whoever did this is someone I've met. I think they may have felt me walk that northwest corner and felt me recognize the shape of what they'd left there. I don't know what they make of that. The horses haven't crossed the north fence in 3 months. Elena treats it as a practical problem. She's moved her grazing rotation to work around it. Practical, as I said. 40 years of working in a high valley with the unexplained as a regular feature of the landscape. I have 1 more month here. I'll write you again before I leave. Don't worry about me. I know what I know, and I know where the line is. 20 years of learning what I've learned is also 20 years of learning the shape of what I've chosen not to learn. That's not a small thing, but it is a lonely thing, sometimes. To know the shape of a door and to be near it more than once and to still be on the right side of it. This is longer than I meant to write. The valley does this. There's nothing else to look at and plenty to think about, and the cold makes everything internal. Write me something back. Tell me about the clinic. Tell me something ordinary and specific and good. With love, Mirabelle. P.S. Keep this letter, but don't leave it anywhere. You know what I mean. I'm gonna tell you what I saw, and then I'm gonna tell you what happened when I found the person who'd seen the same thing 6 months before me on the same stretch of road. The combination of those two things is what I can't account for. Either one alone I could probably file and move on. Together, they've been sitting in my head for almost a year, and I've decided that writing it out is the only thing I haven't tried. I was driving through southern Utah in September, specifically the road that runs along the edge of the canyon country, south of the Needles District, heading east toward Colorado. This is not one of the main park roads. It's a county road that connects a few access points and goes through some long, uninhabited stretches before it hits the next small town. I'd gone that way because I'd taken a wrong turn, and my GPS had decided to route me through the scenic path rather than admit error. It was around 8 p.m. The canyon country at that hour has a particular quality. The orange light going purple, the mesas losing their edges, the sky doing several colors at once. I had the window down because the air was cooling fast, and it smelled like the red rock and cedar that you don't get anywhere else. The road had been empty for about 40 minutes at that point. No other vehicles in either direction. The county roads through that part of Utah have that quality after sunset in the off-season. You can drive for half an hour and see nothing except the road and what the headlights make of the terrain on either side, and the darkness beyond the headlights that has a weight to it, unlike the darkness elsewhere. The canyon country at night is not empty, so much as occupied by something that isn't giving anything back to you. My headlights caught something at the side of the road, a figure. I registered it as a person immediately, upright, human proportions, in the edge of what the headlights were doing before the dark took over. And then, in the next second, as I got closer, I registered what the figure was doing. It was walking backward, not stumbling, not turning around and walking the other way. Walking backward steadily along the shoulder of the road, facing the darkness ahead of it rather than the direction of travel. Arms loose at its sides, gait even. The way you might walk forward, just inverted. I drove past it at highway speed. In the mirror, nothing, just the road and the dark. I was past it before I processed what I'd seen. I kept driving for maybe 2 miles before I pulled over. I sat on the shoulder in southern Utah with the engine running, and I tried to explain what I'd seen. A person walking backward, reasons to walk backward, exercise, a quirk, something wrong with the vision, some neurological event. People do strange things. People in rural, isolated areas sometimes do strange things that look alarming from a moving car. I had been driving for 6 hours, and my eyes were tired. I sat there and I thought about the gait. Even, not stumbling, not faltering, not the careful backward walk of a person taking care not to trip. An easy backward walk, the way forward walking is easy when you've done it for years. I turned around and drove back. I drove the stretch where I'd seen it twice. Nothing on the shoulder, nothing in the low sage flanking the road, no vehicle parked nearby, no structures visible in any direction. I drove forward again and kept going. I don't know why I posted about it. A Reddit thread about strange experiences in southern Utah. One of those regional forums where people share odd things about a place. I said I'd seen something on the county road and described it. The figure, the backward walk, the disappearance when I'd looked in the mirror. I said I didn't know what to make of it and wasn't looking for explanations. Just wanted to see if anyone else had been on that road. I got the usual range of responses: hallucination, hypnagogic state from long driving, teenagers messing around, Bigfoot, inevitable. One person who said this was standard behavior for a county with a lot of meth and left it at that. And then, about a week after I posted, a message from a user I didn't recognize. They said they'd been on that road in March, 6 months before my September. They said they'd seen the same thing, not similar, the same. A figure on the shoulder walking steadily backward, arms at its sides, facing away from the direction of travel. They said they'd posted about it at the time, but the thread had died without engagement, and they'd let it go. They'd been looking for anyone else who'd been on that road. We messaged back and forth for about a week. I want to be careful here about what the exchange established and what it didn't. We saw it at different times of day. They'd seen it around dusk. I'd seen it around 8 p.m. So both in low light. Different seasons, March and September, both on the same county road, same general stretch, within maybe 3 miles of each other. The physical description was consistent. Upright human figure, backward gait, no sound, gone when either of us looked back or turned around. The detail they'd noted that I hadn't thought to describe was the arms. They said the arms hung in a way that wasn't quite right for walking, too still, not the natural swing that accompanies movement. When they described it, I realized I had noticed it too, without noting it. The arms had been still, not clasped, not in pockets, just hanging, as if the movement was being produced from somewhere above them rather than generated naturally from the body's own momentum. That's a specific thing to notice independently. The fact that two people in a Reddit thread both describe backward walking figures on an isolated road doesn't prove anything except that the road is isolated and humans pattern match. I know theirs. But the conversation turned at a certain point. They asked me, "Did you feel like it saw you?" I hadn't thought about it in those terms. I'd been focused on what I'd seen, not what had looked back. But when they asked the question, I had an answer before I'd thought about it. Yes. Yes, I had felt seen. Not in the sense of eye contact. I'd have been moving too fast for eye contact, and the figure had been facing away from me, but in the sense of having been identified. The way you know sometimes that someone in a crowd has spotted you before you've spotted them. They said they'd felt the same thing. They said, "It's the part I couldn't explain and the part I couldn't leave alone." We talked about this. Both of us had driven past quickly. Both of us had turned around to look back. Both of us had found nothing. We compared the physical descriptions point by point. The gait was what we kept coming back to. Not hurried, not stumbling, not a nervous backward glance over the shoulder. Just steady backward walking, like that was simply the direction of travel. They told me they'd done some research after their sighting about the area, the land use, the history, the cultural context. There's a lot to that part of Utah that I didn't know and that most passing travelers don't know. They shared some of what they'd read. I've read more since. The canyon country in that stretch of San Juan County has a particular cultural and historical weight that changes the context of what you see on those roads at night. Not as an explanation, but as a frame that makes the experience legible in a way it isn't when you treat it as something random. They said, "I read about what can look almost right, but not quite." They said, "The gait is the thing. Something that moves like a person but doesn't have the full repertoire. And moving backward, never getting the forward gait right, using the backward one instead." Cousin, I looked this up after. What they were describing connects to specific law about the nature of these things. That in certain forms, the imitation isn't perfect. That the gait gives it away, if you're looking. And sometimes, even if you're not. I don't know what to do with that. I'm not from that part of the country, and I don't have a cultural relationship to what I read, but the description is very specific and it matches very specifically what I saw. We stopped messaging after a while. I didn't have anything useful left to add, and they'd said what they had to say. Our last exchange was them asking if I'd gone back. I said no. They said, good. I've been looking at maps of that stretch of road for almost a year. I've been planning drives through southern Utah and rerouting around it by habit now, without consciously deciding to. I'll notice I've chosen the main highway. I'll notice I've added 40 minutes to the drive. I'll notice and not change it. I keep thinking about the gate, not frightened, not hesitant, just steady. The figure had been walking that shoulder for however long, and it had been walking backward, and it wasn't a problem for the figure. It was just what it was doing. The road was there. The dark was behind it. It moved through both without difficulty and without hurry, and it had been doing so in March, and it had been doing so in September, and for all I know, it had been doing so for longer than either of us had been alive to see it. And I keep thinking about what they asked me. Did you feel like it saw you? And the answer, which keeps being yes, which was yes before I thought about it, which is the kind of answer that comes from somewhere below the thinking. The figure was facing away from me. Its back was to the road. By the geometry of it, it shouldn't have been able to see me at all. That's the part that doesn't resolve. The figure facing away, the feeling of being identified. The way both of us, 6 months apart, came away from that road carrying the same specific unease. There's a specific quality to what I've been carrying from that road. It's not the kind of unease that fades as the moment recedes. It has been almost a year, and the conversation I keep having with myself about it has not gotten simpler. If anything, the more I've read about that part of the canyon country, its history, the cultural context of the land, the more the experience fits into a frame that doesn't make it easier to dismiss. The other witness said something in one of our last messages that I've thought about since. They said they'd been living their life in a way that assumed things were what they looked like. They said they were finding that harder to maintain. I understood. I am finding it harder to maintain too, and I'm not sure what I put in its place. I don't know what we saw. I know we saw the same thing, 6 months apart, on the same road, at the same hour of evening in 2 different seasons. I know the road was empty in both directions when we turned around. I know neither of us has been back. That's what I know. I'm not sure what to do with it, except keep not going back. The Witch Purge of 1878 is a documented historical event. This is the part that keeps drawing me back to it. It is not folklore. It is in the agency records. 40 Navajo men and women were killed near the Ganado Agency over a period of weeks, accused of practicing witchcraft. The Indian agent at the time, W.F. Arney, made efforts to contain the killing and failed. The deaths are recorded. The names, where they were recorded at all, are in the National Archives. My project began as a straightforward history of post-Long Walk social disruption. The ways that the trauma of the 1864 removal and the 4 years of imprisonment at Bosque Redondo restructured Navajo society in the 1870s and 1880s. The witch purge is one of several events in this period that historians have addressed lightly, partly because the primary sources are thin, and partly because the subject matter sits at the intersection of history and belief in a way that makes historians uncomfortable. I'm not uncomfortable with it, or I wasn't when I started. I want to establish something before I describe tonight, because it matters for how you read what I'm about to write. I have spent 3 years in this material. I have read the primary sources, the agency records, the Indian Rights Association correspondence, the sparse oral history documentation from the 1930s and 1940s. I have interviewed historians who specialize in this period. I am not a credulous person, and I am not a person who reached for supernatural explanations early in this project or at any point before tonight. I am writing this at 1 in the morning in a motel room in Estancia, New Mexico, because I am not ready to sleep, and because writing is how I process things I cannot otherwise account for. And I want you to understand the baseline I'm working from when I describe what I heard. I'm writing this in a motel room in Estancia, New Mexico, at 1 a.m. because I heard something in the field tonight that I haven't been able to explain to myself in the 3 hours since I came inside. I'll get to that. I want to establish the context first, because the context is what makes it significant rather than just strange. The Estancia Basin is a closed basin in central New Mexico, an inland drainage, no outlet to a river, water that has been accumulating in the flatland for thousands of years and going nowhere. The surrounding plains are high and flat and pale with grass that doesn't commit to any particular color. The mountains are visible on all sides but distant. The sky is enormous in the way that enclosed basins produce when the surrounding mountains give the sky an edge. I'm here because the basin was, in the 1870s and 1880s, a contact zone. Navajo territory to the west, Spanish and later Anglo settlement from the east, a place where the different communities met or avoided each other depending on the year and the mood of the territory. The communities that existed here in the years after the long walk had particular knowledge of what was coming out of the Navajo Nation during a period of intense social disruption. The witch purge started as something local, internal to the Navajo Nation, a response to perceived supernatural harm at a moment when the community was under enormous stress. Post-Long Walk, post-Bosque Redondo, the Navajo people were attempting to reconstitute a functioning society on land that had been damaged and partially redistributed during their absence. There were disputes, there were accusations. The accusations took the form available to the culture. What interests me, what has always interested me, academically, is the question of what, specifically, the accused were believed to have done. Not the folk belief aspect of it, the social function. Who was accused and why? What pattern the accusations followed? Whether the purge had a social logic beneath the supernatural framing. The pattern that emerges from the records is not random. The accused were predominantly former medicine people, healers who, in the estimation of the community, had crossed from healing practice into something else. The accusation in most cases was not that they had done a specific harm to a specific person, but that they had become a specific kind of person. The community was not primarily judging acts, it was judging transformation. This distinction matters more the longer I've worked with the material. We have a framework in Western legal tradition for judging acts. You did this specific thing. You are accountable for it. The witch purge does not fit that framework, and historians who've tried to apply it to the 1878 event have consistently gotten it wrong. The community was not conducting trials. It was attempting to identify and remove something that had changed, something that had been one thing and had chosen to become another. The wrongness was in the becoming, not in any catalogable act. This is a different problem, and it requires a different kind of attention to see clearly. I've been sitting with this for 3 years. The question it raises, academically, is whether communities can reliably identify internal actors who have become structurally dangerous, and whether the form, the identification, takes matters more or less than the accuracy. This is the kind of question that looks very different from inside a community than from outside it. I'm an outsider. I came to the Basin to find anyone with living memory that connects to this period, not to the witch purge itself, which is 5 generations back, but to the community knowledge that has persisted around it, oral history that has stayed in families. I found it. 2 conversations, neither of which I'll describe in detail here, that suggest the community knowledge around what the accused were and what they did is more continuous and specific than the academic literature implies. The people I spoke to were careful. They spoke in approximations and adjacencies, the way people speak about something they live next to rather than something they've read about. One woman said to me, "The ones who were killed were not innocent." She said it without apology. She said the question was never whether. The question was who, and who decides. This is the weight of the historical record, if you read it carefully enough. The witch purge was not a panic. It was a reckoning. A community attempting to identify, with the tools it had, something it was living in the middle of. I drove back to my motel from her house in the dark, across the flat Basin roads, and I was thinking about what she'd said and what it implied about the 1878 event and about the community dynamics that shaped it. At some point on the drive, I became aware of drumming. I want to be precise. I was not near any community event. I was on a county road across open flat land, 3 miles from the nearest paved surface. The time was around 10:30 p.m. There were no structures visible. I had driven this road twice in daylight. I knew what was on it and what was adjacent to it. There is nothing out there that would produce drumming. The sound was not loud. I became aware of it the way you become aware of a sound that has been present for a while before you notice it. The kind of awareness that makes you uncertain whether it started when you became conscious of it or before. I turned the radio off. Yes, something rhythmic, low, coming from a direction I couldn't orient to. I turned the car around once, slowly, listening through the window, and the direction didn't change in the way it should have if the source were fixed. The rhythm was wrong. I don't know how else to say it. There was a rhythm, but it didn't resolve into anything I could predict. I kept waiting for the beat to establish itself, to repeat in a way I could follow, and it kept not doing that. It would almost stabilize and then shift, not randomly, with what felt like intention, like it was avoiding being predictable. I sat on the county road with the window down for probably 10 minutes. Then it stopped. The cessation was as abrupt as the sound had been gradual. One moment it was there, the next the basin was silent in the complete, sealed way that enclosed basins are silent at night. I drove back to the motel and I've been sitting here since. Here is what I've been thinking about. The woman I spoke with today said that what the community recognized in 1878 was not a set of acts, but a transformation. Something that had happened inside a person, slowly, that expressed itself outward in ways the community could read. The reading was imperfect. She was clear about that. The reckoning caught some who were not what they were accused of being. But the category was real, she said. The thing the community was trying to identify was real. I've spent 3 years treating this as a sociological question. A community under duress, developing a response that is internally coherent, even if not epistemically grounded. That is how I've been thinking about it. I've been wondering, in the 3 hours since I came inside, whether that framework is as complete as I thought it was. What the historical record tells me is that 40 people were killed in 1878 for being something the community needed to be rid of. The community was under extreme duress and may have been wrong about some of them and may have been right about others. The records don't tell me which. What the woman told me today is that the knowledge of what those 40 people were has not gone away in 5 generations. It has been held carefully, passed between people who need to know it, used to identify things that are still present in the living community. I cannot account for the drumming. I don't have a framework that accounts for it, that doesn't require me to revise my understanding of what I'm researching. That is a very strange position for a historian. 3 years I have been treating the 1878 witch purge as a historical event whose horror was social. The dynamics of accusation and violence in a traumatized community. I still think that framing is partially correct. I'm no longer sure it's complete. The question I came here with was, who decides? Who gets to identify what is dangerous, using what criteria? And what does it mean when that identification requires killing? I still don't have a complete answer to that question. But sitting here at 1 a.m., listening to the basin outside, I have a different question now. The one underneath it. What if the community was right? Not about all 40, but about the thing itself, about the category of transformation it was trying to identify and contain. What if the reckoning, however imperfect, was a reckoning with something real? I don't know how to write that as history. I don't know how to not write it either now. The project I started 3 years ago as a study in post-traumatic social disruption has become something else. I'm not sure yet what it has become. What I know is that the drumming I heard tonight on a county road 3 miles from any structure was not weather and was not atmospheric and was not the kind of thing that gets simpler when you sit alone in a motel room applying more rational frameworks to it. It was what it was. And what it was, I think, is the thing I've been writing about for 3 years without understanding that I was writing about it from outside the room it occupied. I'm gonna tell you about the knocking first, and then I'm gonna tell you about what came after, and you can draw your own line between them. I've been drawing that line in my head for 3 years, and I still can't say exactly where it sits. I was working a ranch in Owyhee County, Idaho, the southwest corner of the state, as remote as Idaho gets, which is saying something. The ranch ran about 800 head across mountain country that went from sagebrush flats to dense Douglas fir, depending on elevation. I'd taken the work in late fall on a short contract just through winter. The ranching family lived 40 minutes away in a small town. During the week, it was just me at the main house and another hand named Corey in a cabin a half-mile up the ridge. The isolation didn't bother me. I'd done isolated work before. The knocking started about 3 weeks in. I don't mean a knock at the door. I mean a knock at a window. The kitchen window, specifically, which looks out toward the equipment shed and the tree line beyond it. A short, deliberate sound. Not the random tapping of a branch against glass, not the settling of the structure. A knock, the kind a person makes when they want you to know they're there. I got up from the table and went to the window. The equipment shed was about 30 feet from the house. The tree line began about 50 feet beyond that. The night was clear, and there was enough moonlight on the snow that I could see to the trees without a flashlight. There was nothing between the house and the trees. The knocking came again, from the living room window on the side of the house. I went to the living room window. Nothing on that side, just the slope of the property going down to where the road was, with the snow lit blue-white in the moonlight. No tracks, no vehicle. Knocking from the kitchen again. I stood in the middle of the kitchen floor and I thought, someone is moving around the outside of this house, knocking on windows as they go. This is the explanation that fits the facts. A person, and then, immediately, the other fact. There were no tracks in the snow. The snow had been cleaned when I'd come in at dusk. The temperature had been below freezing all day. Whatever was out there moving between windows had not come through the snow. The knocking stopped after maybe 10 minutes. I checked every window. I turned on the exterior lights. I went outside in my coat with a flashlight and walked the perimeter of the house. No tracks, no disturbance. The snow around the house was as clean as when I'd come in. I told Corey in the morning. He listened with the expression people get when they're deciding whether to take something seriously. He said, "Have you been around any Navajo people recently?" This was not a question I expected. I told him no. I asked him why he was asking. He set down his coffee and looked at the window for moments the way people look at something that isn't there when they're deciding how much to say. Corey was not a dramatic person. He was a working hand from Central Oregon who'd spent 15 years on ranches across the Intermountain West, and he didn't say things for effect. The question had been a genuine question, not a setup for a story. That was the part I noticed before he answered. He said he'd worked a ranch in Nevada once, on the northern edge of the reservation, and he'd heard something similar described, knocking that moved around a building. He said the hand who told him about it had been Navajo, and had said the important thing was not to open the door or go toward where the sound was coming from. I asked him what it was. He said, the guy didn't say exactly. He said something that does it to see if you'll respond. If you respond, you give it something to work with. Corey went back to his coffee. He said, "You didn't go outside, did you?" I told him I had. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Well, keep an eye on yourself." I don't know what he thought I should be watching for. I didn't ask. At the time, I thought it was the kind of general advice that people give when they're not sure what else to say. I've thought about it differently since. The knocking happened 2 more times over the following 2 weeks. And each time I didn't respond. I stayed where I was, didn't go to the windows, waited for it to stop. It stopped. I wasn't frightened exactly, but I was alert in a new way, which is a kind of tiredness all its own. The last time it happened, I noticed something in the morning that I hadn't noticed after the first 2 times. A fine, pale dust on the south windowsill, the window that faced the tree line, light enough that I'd missed it the first times, or it hadn't been there. Now it was there, and I noticed it because I was looking. I took a wet rag and wiped it off without thinking. Within a week, I was sick. I want to be careful here about what I'm claiming and what I'm not. I'm not saying with certainty that the 2 things are connected. I'm saying they were in sequence, and that what followed was strange enough that the sequence has never stopped seeming relevant. The illness started as a headache. Not a severe headache, the kind that sits at the back of the skull and is always there when you remember to check. Not debilitating, just constant. By the 2nd week it had moved, not gone from the back of my skull, but also present in my shoulders and jaw in a way that had no precedent in my experience. I'd had migraines before. This wasn't that. Then the sleep went. Not insomnia. I could lie down. I could close my eyes. I could be in a physical state that precedes sleep. I just didn't cross the threshold. I'd be almost there, in the specific darkness that should lead to sleep. And then I'd be aware of the room again. This is hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. It wasn't wakefulness. It was the state just before sleep, held there for hours, like a door that opens partway and stops. I'd get up around 3 a.m. and sit in the kitchen until it was light enough to go to work. The work helped. The physical labor during the day was the one thing that felt normal. The headache during this period had a quality I've tried to describe to doctors without success. It wasn't located, it moved. Not the migraine pattern, which is consistent and predictable once you've had enough of them to recognize them. This moved from the base of the skull to the jaw, to the shoulders, to behind the eyes in a sequence that didn't repeat the same way twice. The doctors in the nearest town tested me for sinus issues, for nerve compression, for sleep deprivation effects. Everything came back normal. I was in normal ranges across every metric they checked. I lost weight without trying. 10 pounds in 3 weeks, which is not gradual, which is the kind of weight loss the doctors use the word concerning about. I wasn't eating differently. I wasn't eating less than I normally would for the work I was doing. The weight left anyway. I drove into town and saw a doctor. The doctor ran blood panels and found nothing. He ordered an ultrasound, found nothing. He referred me to a specialist in Boise who found nothing and ordered more tests, which found nothing. The pain moved around my body in a way that meant it didn't fit any category. The weight loss continued for a month and then stopped, for no reason the doctors could identify. I was sick for 11 weeks. In the 11th week, I woke up one morning and the headache was gone. Not diminished, gone. I lay in bed, waiting for it to come back, and it didn't. I slept a full night that night, for the first time in nearly 3 months. I've been trying since then to account for what happened. The logical explanations: stress, overwork, some virus that ran its course, some deficiency that corrected itself. I've considered all of these. None of them quite fit the pattern. The way the symptoms moved, the way they didn't respond to anything, and then resolved completely. I called Corey the following winter. He'd moved to a ranch in Montana by then. I described the illness to him. He listened. He said, "You wiped the windowsill." I asked him what that meant. He said, "The guy in Nevada told me, if you find a powder or a dust anywhere around the house after one of these things, you don't touch it with your bare hands. You get help. There are people who know what to do with it." He said the guy had told him this very specifically, and he'd filed it and forgotten it until I described what I'd wiped off the south window. He said, "I should have told you this earlier. I'm sorry." I said it was fine. I'd recovered. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah, but that's not always how it goes." I've thought about that a lot. That's not always how it goes. I don't know what I encountered that winter in Owyhee County. I don't have a framework that makes everything about it make sense. The knocking with no tracks, the powder on the sill, the 11 weeks of symptoms that doctors couldn't name, the sudden, complete resolution. I can't make those things into a clean story. What I can tell you is that when I wake up at 3 a.m. now, which I still do occasionally, a habit left over from those months in the kitchen, I lie still. I don't get up and go to the window. I don't check what made a sound. I've learned that checking costs something. I don't know if what I encountered was what Corey's guy in Nevada meant when he talked about these things. I don't know if the illness was connected. I can't prove it, and I don't need to. What I know is the sequence, the knocking in the night, the dust on the sill that I wiped with my bare hand, the 11 weeks that followed. Whatever was circling that house in the snow, I went outside to look for it, and I wiped what it left with my bare hand. And then I was sick for 11 weeks, in a way that doctors couldn't name and couldn't touch. I don't go towards sounds in the night anymore. This covers a lot of situations. You would be surprised how many things in a rural ranch at night sound like something you should check on. A gate blown loose, a bird in the rafters, an animal in the brush outside the window. Before Owyhee County, I would have gone to check on all of them. I don't anymore. I wait. I listen to whether the sound resolves on its own. Mostly it does. The rule covers everything else. I keep that rule. Corey keeps it too, as far as I know. We've spoken a few times since that winter. Neither of us talks about Owyhee County much. But when the conversation touches on it, there's an understanding that doesn't need a lot of words. The shared knowledge of two people who learn the same thing by different routes, and who both keep the same small cloth pouch in the same coat pocket. I keep that rule. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. If you enjoyed the stories and want to hear more just like them, subscribe. I release 3 new videos each week. Good night.